In this lesson, we're going to discuss the Transparencies panel of the Advanced Material Editor. Alright, so I've loaded in 07_begin file scene here, and we're going to grab the C object, and let's go ahead and load on the default water material under the liquids collection, and let's open that up in our material editor. Now let's make sure that we're in the Advanced Material Editor here, and we're under the Transparency panel. Now the first thing that we'll see under the Transparency panel is going to be our Global Transparency section, and you'll see that this is set to 100%. Now if we take this down to 0, it's going to make this material seem solid or opaque. Now by taking this up to 100%, that means that light is going to pass completely through this material, making it seem transparent or invisible. Now, what you're seeing on this particular material are refractions and bumps and things like that, and blurriness. So that's how we're able to see the material itself. We're not actually seeing a specific color being shown through here. Now, if we go to our next section called Blurred Transparency, this is going to distort our transparencies, so it's going to make them a little more blurry. Now, you can make this more apparent if you take the transparency down. This will begin to blur and be a little more visible. Okay. Now, the next section is probably the most important section here, and it's called the Refraction Index, or also known as the Index of Refraction. Now this is going to control how our transparency looks or how it behaves. So if we wanted a transparent material to seem like it was a gas or some sort of air, we would want to set our refraction index to around 1.0. Now you'll see how this changes our material altogether. Now like if we want to have water, we would set that to 1.33, which was that default value that we first started at. Now if we want this to look like glass, we would set it to about 1.52. Okay? And these values come straight from View themselves. These are the recommended values for those types of materials. Now let's set this back to 1.33, and let's move on to flare. Now flare is going to be the aspect in which objects are going to be much brighter whenever they are behind a sun or in front of a sun. So if we were to say use flare on a cloud material, we would take our intensity up, which is going to be the amount of brightness that we get, and we would have our span, which is the overall size of the flare. Now this flare is only visible if an object is in front of the sun itself. So this is not going to be really helpful for us because we have a sea level. We wouldn't be able to rotate it around to where we could see the sun itself. But you could experiment by creating just a sphere type material and then adjusting that flare. Okay? So like I said, this is really helpful for objects like clouds in which they're going to be in front of the sun. It's going to make them much brighter. Now our next section is turn reflective with angle. Now what this is going to do is adjust our reflectivity based on the angle in which we're viewing this material. So by default this is set to 40%, and this is going to be this is going to yield a good result for you. Now you could adjust this higher or lower just to make your tweaks if you need to. But what I want to do is just show you exactly how this works here and what it looks like in the scene. So I'm going to hit OK on this, and let's do a render. Let's do a quick render right here in our preview here. Let's wait for that to render out. Okay, so now that this is finished rendering, what you'll see with this reflective angle is that we're getting a reflection off of our mountains and things like that into our water material. And what's going to happen is as we bump up that angle, at higher angles we're going to be able to see a little bit more of that reflectivity. So to look at this at a different value, let's take this up to about 80, and we'll hit OK, and then we'll re-render that, and then I'll use our picture to kind of show the difference between this. So let's go ahead and let this render out. Okay, so now that that is finished rendering there, you'll notice that we're getting a little bit more reflectivity closer to the bottom of the image here. So as we increase that angle, we're able to get more reflectivity out of it. Now it's kind of like looking at a glass like a wine glass or something like that, at kind of the side. So if you're looking at the outside edge of this glass here, you're going to see that it's a little more reflective because that glass begins to overlap itself and become a little bit more solid. And that's where we get that higher reflectivity. Now, as we look toward the center of that wine glass, the reflectivity is relatively low because we're able to see right through it. All right? So that's kind of the effect that we're getting here. So if you want to see the difference, if you're looking at it and you can't really tell, go right up here to your pictures, and you can look at this latest one that we've just rendered, and then we switch over to the other, and you'll see how we get less reflectivity in this overall. Okay. Now let's bring up our material editor again, and let's move on up to the effects. Now the effects are going to give us a couple of different options as we go throughout them. So let's just kind of begin to discuss what each of these effects do, and then we'll talk about the options that they provide. So the first one that we have is fuzzy. Now by selecting this object, it's going to, or this option, it will make the edges of our object seem fuzzy or even blurred instead of being sharp. Now whenever we check this, you'll notice that it's going to change our material altogether. Now the options that it gives us is a slider called fuzziness, and we can make it solid or we can make it fuzzy. Now it appears to be absolutely like a gas, and you'll see that refraction index is no longer available. So this does have a little bit of limited capabilities here. Now this is going to be used for a specific kind of material, not necessarily water. Now as we drop this fuzziness down, you'll see that we get a little bit more opaqueness out of our material, and you'll see how it's blurred on this outside edge here. Now let's turn off fuzzy, and you'll see that our material has changed altogether. And the reason that it's changed is because it has changed different options here. So let's take our refraction index back to 1.33, and we'll get that water material again. And you'll notice that it's very blue, and that's because it's changed our fading out here. So let's change this back to clear, and we'll go to about 30%. Let's just type that in. All right. So now let's go to additive. Now by clicking on additive, what this is going to do is it's going to set the color of our material, well, let's say it this way. The color of our material is added to that of the background, yielding kind of a luminous immaterial on illuminous material objects. So if we turn this off, you'll see that we have kind of like these white background colors that are in here. And if I turn it on, we get more of that, and it scatters them a little bit more here. Right? Now let's turn that off. You can see the difference there. Now let's go to physical transparency first before we get to variable transparency. So physical transparency, it allows for a physical simulation of light volumetric scattering and absorption through our transparent material here. It's really suited for glass materials and water simulation. So let's turn this on, and you'll see how this changes our material altogether. And that's because some of our options have changed here. So with this physical transparency, let's change our index of refraction back to 1.33. Okay, and you'll see here now we're getting a little bit more of a water look here. And we have our intensity and span on our flare. That's still the same. Our reflective angle is grayed out. That's not being taken into account any longer because this is now being simulated physically. Now the control that we have over this physical transparency is going to be done by absorption and scattering. So we have some modes that we can work from, and they all work a little bit differently. Now by default we have direct volumetric light, and what this is going to do is it's going to allow for a very nice physical simulated water for the transparency, and any areas that are directly hit by light will cause ray traces, and that's what we need for physical simulation of light, is ray traced rays. All right. Now if we switch this to indirect volumetric light, any light that hits this material is going to produce a ray trace, and again that's going to allow for more physical simulation, a more accurate simulation. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to bump up your render time. Now, if you don't need the indirect volumetric light, use the direct. Now, we have fast ocean, and this is to be used on ocean-type materials for water. We want to create this on oceans because we're going to be further back away from them, and we're not going to be able to see any type of transparencies as much. So if you need something really quick, use fast ocean. Now let's go back to that direct volumetric light, and let's talk about these different options that we have available to us very quickly. Now we have depth here, and this specifies the distance beyond which objects aren't visible anymore through this material. So we're going to determine when this material is no longer transparent. Okay, so by hitting OK, and let's do a quick render of this. I'm going to pause it just to let this render out. So once this is rendered out, it appears that this water is shallow based on the amount or distance we gave it. Now if we go back in here and we adjust this and we go to deep, it's going to change the overall look. Let's go ahead and refresh this here. So I'm going to do preview quality. Let's do fast. Let me left click on it, try to get this to refresh here. That way we don't have to re-render all of that. Now what we're going to see is we're going to see a little bit more reflectivity on the water itself at longer distances, and at a shorter distance it's going to appear to be shallow again. So if you want to see this up close, you can always do a quick render again, and we can take a look at the differences in the picture there. Okay, so now that this is finished rendering, let's take a look at the differences in those changes. So let's go up to pictures here, and if we switch back to the one before, you'll notice that we get a very hard line along the horizon of our water. And it's because this is supposed to be appearing as if this is shallow up to this distance here. Now as I come back to here, you'll see that blurs there. Now the major feature of this is whenever an object is behind this material, and we're actually looking at that object. Now by adjusting that depth, it's going to determine if this water is very deep or if it's shallow. Okay, so it's just going to change the visibility of the object behind it. All right. Now let's close this out, and let's go in and start talking about absorption and scattering here. So absorption specifies the remaining fraction of light after absorption by the material's particles themselves. Basically what this means is whenever light hits an object, it can be absorbed into the material. And that's what we're changing here. So we want to determine this by the overall color of the object itself. Now scattering is a different, or it's kind of like the opposite. We have absorption where the light hits it and is absorbed into the object. So it's kind of like rubber. If you take a ball of rubber and you look at it and light is hitting it, it's being absorbed into that object because there's no reflectivity of light coming out of that. Now scattering is light being scattered across the material. Okay, so scattering is a great example of that is skin. As light hits your skin, there's light is being scattered in different directions, causing different colors and that sort of thing. So if we were to adjust our scattering here, let's go to like a green color, you'll see how that changes. We get a lot of blue up here toward the top. It's mostly green here, but it is scattering that light. We have absorption. Let's change this color as well. Let's go to like a blue, and you'll see how that kind of changes it a little bit. Not a lot, but just a little. Okay, let's switch these back to those default colors that scattering was set to gray. So let's go back down there, and I'll hit OK. There we go. Now we have our anisotropy, which is backward and forward. Now this is going to determine how light is statistically scattered across or through this material. Now I know that we're getting into some terms that are a little confusing here, but with backward and forward, what this means is whenever light is scattered on this material, if we are set to a more forward value, light is going to go ahead and move forward and scatter forward into the material. Now if it's set to backward, that light is mostly going to scatter in the direction in which that light was projected. Right? Now finally we have our quality boost, and quality boost is going to get rid of any noise while using our absorption and our scattering here. So if I take this up to better, we're going to get less noise in there. You can see that this appears to be a little more blurry once this is finished rendering out here. Okay, so you can go up to a better quality and get something that look a little nicer. Now you'll notice how much longer it takes for this to render, so that's something that you want to be careful of. So type in back to 0, you'll see how that preview comes in very, very quickly here. Alright, now let's turn off this physical transparency and talk about variable transparency really quickly. Now variable transparency is going to seem very familiar to the variable highlights that we had in the last lesson. So whenever we check that, we get this function that comes up that we can choose. So variable transparency is going to allow us to have materials that are opaque in some areas and then very transparent in others. So anywhere in the function that is black is going to be opaque, and anywhere that is white is going to be transparent. So to show this, let's click on one of these and let's go to one of these different functions here. Let's try to find one that's very nice. Let's try this cracks here. And you'll see that in this cracks we have areas that are opaque. Okay, so we have a lot of this white value, and then the parts that are transparent are the black values, right? Or I'm sorry, the white values. Okay, in this function here. Now we can also adjust this function by using its filters, so the transparency and the blurring values. All right. Now let's turn off variable transparency and end with fading out here. So whenever you're working with water, you can make it clear or you can make it murky. Now if you make it murky, you're going to get more of these colors here. So you're going to have your fade out color. It's going to be this blue. So let's say we wanted to make this water kind of a green color. So let's do something a little bit darker green. You'll see how you get that change. And then we want our light color, basically the color that's going to be passing through whenever light is passing through this material. Let's make this kind of a lighter green. And then we'll hit OK. Okay, so that's going to give us something a little bit different. Now, let's turn that reflective angle back down to 40 there. Okay, and you can see how that's changing that altogether. We're not getting as much transparency there. But we've taken a look at all of these different options here, and this was a pretty long lesson, but there's quite a bit inside of transparencies. There's so many different index of refraction and just different mathematical, and can be a little confusing at times on how this is controlled. But like I said earlier, if you want to take a look at that Exploring Mental Ray Materials in Maya course with Ed Wedstone, there's a lesson in there that is going to be very helpful, and it's just chock full of information that could help you with materials. Now in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can control reflections in our Advanced Material Editor. So I'll see you then.